Here in the United States, we've seen the interest in language study, particularly around Chinese, decline precipitously. And that is just absolutely tragic that people are turning inward at the very moment when these changes are taking place. With that in mind, I'd like to read a couple sections of your book just to talk about the role of Europe, China, and the United States. You said that the Western world, with Europe still heavily shielded by the U.S.'s power, will not cede its privileges willingly. That's a really important theme, and I'd like you to touch on that. You said about the role of China. China's rise is not necessarily seen as a rallying call to unite behind Beijing, presumably from countries in the global south, but as opening up economic opportunities that also encourage fresh thinking about a world more independent of the West. And then on the United States, you say that we've lived through an era of U.S. global dominance. So it's no surprise that the one thing uniting Biden and Trump, and now, of course, Harris and Trump, in their outlook was a dogged determination to prevent China from becoming number one. And I can recount to you a conversation that I had with an analyst, a scholar at the Atlantic Council, and he explained to me in the most blunt terms. He said, Eric, our opposition to China is that they want to be number one and we are number, and we want to prevent them from becoming number one because we want to stay number one. And that was how this analyst at the Atlantic Council kind of framed the competition. So with that in mind, you're writing on Europe, China, and the U.S. and their respective roles in this new era of Westlessness. Can you speak to those changes?
Yes, and just to quickly comment on that observation, that's probably the most honest depiction of the US's perception of China that there is. And I honestly find a lot of the way it's publicly presented is very euphemistic, because it is about status anxiety. Of course, if you're top of the tree, you're looking over your shoulder when someone very credibly looks like they're going to, well, I think with China, not even overtake the US, because as I say, that's not a given, but just to be able to live in extraordinary success while ignoring the US's ways of doing things. That in itself is an insult. I think with regards to the West will be independently powerful and numerous enough to continue to be self-obsessed for the immediate future. But I think some things will start to crack. I'll give you one very concrete example, which is understandably the G7 and the Europeans in particular, but also the Biden administration, has really tried to collapse the Russian economy and stop its invasion of Ukraine. And as I think we all know, one of the big reasons the sanctions that are led by the G7 haven't worked is that Russia can keep trading with India, with China, even with Indonesia, with Turkey, with others. And it's interesting that the West itself just doesn't occupy the same hold over the world economy. That's a very material thing that will make people, I think, realize that if you pull those levers in the West, in this day and age, you may not necessarily get the same outcomes as you might have done 20 or 30 years ago. But that's quite, I think, still a quite elite foreign policy perspective. Where I wonder, the West might be permeated by non-Western influences is in some things around culture, because the demography of the world is changing so that more people than ever as a percentage will be non-Western than they are Western. I go into the numbers on that in the book. But there are some interesting indicators already. They aren't very big, but I would certainly say that it's interesting that some of the most played mobile phone video games, free downloadable games, are actually Chinese, most played around the world. And you do wonder whether, there are certain ways in which, and obviously there's TikTok as well, which I know is a platform, not the content, but there are certain things that are starting to come through the cracks of non-Western influences seeping into the West. South Korean popular culture, of course. Bollywood films have always been very popular in Asia, but there's, I think, possibility that you might just find that, the West's monopoly on its own tastes starts to evolve a little bit, just because to flip that over, most other parts of the world, people consume popular culture material. Some of it's a bit Western and a bit sort of glitzy, whether it's, Michael Jackson in the 80s or different incarnations of pop music, or whether it's Hollywood films, but they juxtapose it with local language material as well. I actually think the local language material and the non-Western rivals and versions of things will just probably improve in quality as the middle classes of other parts of the world start to become a bit richer. And then eventually you just have a situation where I think we'll look back on the 20th century, early 21st century, in decades to come and think, well, that was really strange that the West was so dominant and so many people looked up to and to the West. How the West reacts to that is, I think, very much to be seen. But I think the last concluding observation I'd have is generationally it matters. So, in 10 years, most world leaders will be millennials. In 20, 25 years, there'll be Gen Z world leaders and leaders in the West. They won't be as steeped in tales of Cold War triumph as people like Anthony Blinken or David Cameron are. I don't think that means they'll reject the West's own narratives of history. I just think they'll grow up with a different set of global experiences, different ways in which Western people are received when they travel around the world, rather than being received sometimes as walking wallets or as gods, as they may have been. That's by the way, a quote from Nelson Mandela's autobiography. 80, 90 years ago, the white people walking through South Africa were seen as gods by me when I was a child. That's to evoke just how far we've come from sort of racialized connotations of power and influence. Thinking ahead 20, 30 years, I think we'll just see a lot more evening out, and possibly the emergence of other cultures and nationalities that have a prestige and a wealth and a sort of a glamour about them that may be aspirational totally apart from the West.